The first time scientists actually read Neanderthal DNA, the results seemed to settle a debate that had run for well over a century. Neanderthals, the genetic evidence showed, contributed nothing to modern humans. A separate species, a dead branch, replaced entirely when our own ancestors spread across the world and outcompeted them for good. That conclusion held as accepted science for more than a decade, repeated in textbooks and documentaries as one of the more settled questions in human evolution. It was completely wrong. A more complete genetic test eventually proved Neanderthals didn't simply vanish when modern humans arrived on the scene. Pieces of them are still walking around today, inside nearly everyone reading this sentence whose ancestry traces outside Africa. Start with how badly the popular image of Neanderthals had already been distorted before any of this DNA testing ever began, decades before genetics entered the picture at all. The species was first identified in 1856 when quarry workers digging in Germany's Neander Valley uncovered a set of unusual bones, initially mistaken for the remains of a bear, before geologist Johann Karl Fuhlrott and anatomist Hermann Schaffhausen recognized them as something else entirely, a creature that fit no category either man had encountered before in their respective fields. The species was formally named Homo neanderthalensis in 1864, cementing its place as a distinct branch of the human family tree, even as debate continued for decades afterward over exactly what that branch actually looked like in life, how it behaved, and how closely, if at all, it connected to the ancestors of people living today. For decades afterward, the public image of Neanderthals as hunched, dim-witted brutes traced back largely to a single flawed reconstruction published in 1911, built from a skeleton that happened to have severe arthritis, its curved spine and bent knees mistaken for the species' natural posture rather than the visible effects of one individual's medical condition late in life. That inaccurate image stuck for generations, shaping museum displays, popular illustrations, and textbook diagrams long after archaeologists had already found direct evidence of Neanderthals using sophisticated tools, controlling fire, and in some cases deliberately burying their dead alongside grave goods, behavior far more complex than the caveman stereotype ever allowed for or accounted for in the public imagination. Actual genetic testing arrived in 1997 when a team led by geneticist Svante extracted and sequenced mitochondrial DNA directly from the original Neander Valley specimen, the same bones discovered back in 1856, making it the first ancient human DNA of any kind ever successfully recovered and read by anyone in history. Publishing in the journal Cell, the team compared that fragment of genetic material against modern human mitochondrial DNA collected from a wide range of living populations across multiple continents and found the two sequences were far more different from each other than any two modern humans anywhere on Earth ever are, regardless of how distantly related those living populations might otherwise be from one another geographically or culturally. The conclusion drawn from that result was direct and, at the time, considered essentially airtight given the tools available. Neanderthals fell entirely outside the genetic diversity of modern humans, showing no detectable sign that the two groups had ever interbred at any point across their tens of thousands of years of shared history and occasional geographic overlap. For over a decade afterward, that finding was treated as the scientific final word on the subject, folding neatly into the dominant theory of the era, which held that modern humans expanding out of Africa had simply replaced Neanderthal populations across Europe and Asia through competition alone, without ever meaningfully mixing with them along the way. If you are learning something new, be sure to subscribe. The problem was that mitochondrial DNA only ever tells one narrow slice of an organism's genetic story, passed down exclusively through the maternal line and representing a tiny fraction of an individual's total genetic material, a single thread pulled from a far larger, more complicated tapestry that no one method could fully capture on its own. A definitive answer required something the technology of 1997 simply couldn't deliver: a full nuclear genome, built from the much larger pool of genetic material inherited from both parents, rather than just one narrow maternal line. That breakthrough came in 2010, when Pabo's team, now working at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany, published a draft Neanderthal genome in the journal Science, built primarily from 3 bone fragments recovered from Vindija Cave in Croatia, dated between 38,000 and 44,000 years old, painstakingly reconstructed from genetic material that had spent tens of thousands of years slowly breaking down inside cold, dark limestone caves. Comparing that far more complete genome against DNA collected from people around the world spanning multiple continents and population groups, the team found something the earlier mitochondrial study had missed entirely. Between 1 and 4% of the genome belonging to modern humans outside Africa traces directly back to Neanderthals, concentrated specifically in European and Asian populations, and essentially absent in populations whose ancestry remained entirely within sub-Saharan Africa, a geographic pattern that itself told researchers exactly where and roughly when the crossing must have taken place. Interbreeding had happened after all, most likely somewhere in the Middle East, roughly 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, as modern humans first expanding out of Africa encountered Neanderthal populations already well established across that region for tens of thousands of years before their arrival. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. That correction raised an obvious question worth asking directly. How had the earlier mitochondrial study missed something this significant when its methodology seemed perfectly sound at the time it was conducted? The answer turned out to be almost as interesting as the discovery itself, and it wasn't a matter of the original researchers making some kind of careless mistake. Later research found that Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome material, both inherited along single, narrow genetic lines passed down through only one parent, rather than blended from both, appear to have died out entirely within the hybrid population over time, even while broader Neanderthal genetic material scattered elsewhere throughout the rest of the genome survived and spread steadily across many subsequent generations. Researchers studying the pattern found large stretches of modern human DNA, particularly regions tied to male fertility and the X chromosome specifically, that are almost completely empty of any Neanderthal ancestry at all, a striking pattern consistent with early hybrid offspring, particularly males, facing reduced fertility, gradually filtering Neanderthal genetic material out of those specific sensitive regions over many generations, even as it persisted comfortably everywhere else across the rest of the genome largely undisturbed. The original 1997 study hadn't found the wrong answer through carelessness or a flawed method on the researcher's part. It had asked a narrow, single-threaded question using the one specific genetic marker most likely to have already been erased by that same filtering process over tens of thousands of years, arriving at a conclusion that looked complete and thoroughly convincing at the time, but was actually only ever reading a small, misleading fraction of the full genetic picture available to later researchers with better tools. What survived that filtering process turned out to matter for reasons well beyond ancient history or academic curiosity about a species long gone. Modern genetic studies have found that surviving Neanderthal DNA clusters heavily around genes tied to the immune system, variants that likely helped early modern humans respond to unfamiliar pathogens they encountered for the first time after leaving Africa and entering entirely new environments, inherited advantages against local diseases. Neanderthal populations had already spent hundreds of thousands of years quietly adapting to, before modern humans ever arrived in the region to encounter them. That same inherited genetic material hasn't stayed purely beneficial across all that time, however, and modern medicine has found real, measurable consequences still playing out today. A 2020 study led by geneticist Hugo Zeberg, working alongside Pabo himself, traced a specific genetic variant on chromosome 3 directly inherited from Neanderthals to a significantly elevated risk of severe illness during the COVID-19 pandemic, meaning a piece of Neanderthal genetic material tens of thousands of years old was actively shaping how modern human bodies responded to a virus that didn't even exist until the 21st century, millennia after the last Neanderthal had died. In 2022, Svante received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine specifically for this entire body of work, sequencing the genomes of Neanderthals and the related, previously unknown Denisovan lineage, and fundamentally rewriting how modern humans understand their own origins as a species. Work that began with a single fragment of degraded mitochondrial DNA back in 1997 and ended, 25 years later, with recognition from the highest honor available in medical science, a body of research the Nobel Committee specifically credited with transforming the entire field of human evolutionary genetics. Line up everything Neanderthal DNA has actually revealed, and neither half of the old story survives contact with it. They were never the hunched, dim-witted evolutionary dead end a single flawed skeleton reconstruction convinced the public of for the better part of a century, a caricature that outlasted the actual archaeological evidence, contradicting it for decades before anyone bothered to seriously correct the record. And they were never the cleanly separate, fully replaced species that first genetic test in 1997 seemed to confirm beyond reasonable doubt, a conclusion that held as accepted science for over 10 years before a more complete genome exposed exactly what a single, narrow strand of maternal DNA had missed the whole time. Neanderthals didn't simply disappear when modern humans arrived in their territory the way an entire generation of textbooks once confidently taught. They were absorbed into the population that did, leaving behind genetic material still actively shaping immune responses today, still occasionally raising disease risk during pandemics. Nobody could have predicted tens of thousands of years ago, still sitting quietly inside the DNA of billions of people who have never once thought to wonder where a piece of their own genome actually came from or how old it really is. The species didn't go extinct in the way most people still picture when they hear the word Neanderthal. It became part of what came next, woven permanently into the genetic code of everyone whose ancestors ever crossed paths with them.